From the Internet Law and Policy Foundry, this is the Tech Policy Grind podcast. Every week, our fellows chat with leaders in the technology and internet law and policy space on recent developments and exciting topics such as privacy, internet governance, cybersecurity, tech legislation, and more. I'm your host, Reema Musa, and I'm a member of the fourth cohort of Foundry Fellows. The Foundry is a collaborative organization for internet law and policy professionals who are passionate about disruptive innovation. Welcome back to the Tech Policy Grind. This week, I chatted with Joe Catapano, a Foundry Fellow and the Communications Chair for the fourth cohort of Fellows. He's also the Senior Manager for Stakeholder Engagement in North America for the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN. He works on a host of tech policy issues related to the domain name system, interfacing with a broad-based community including business, civil society, governments, academia, and the technical community. Hi, Joe. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So you have a really interesting career, and I want to just dive right into it. What is it that got you started in this field of tech law and policy?
So in 2012, I was working at the United Nations Foundation. I was working on US-UN relations, mainly securing United States funding for the UN. But from time to time, the UN itself would have special projects that the foundation would take on. So for reference, the United Nations Foundation is a nonprofit. It's separate from the UN itself. However, it functions kind of as the UN's best friend in a way. And so there would be certain initiatives and projects that the UN Foundation staff would work on to help the UN. One of those in 2012 was for the International Telecommunications Union, which is actually a body that predates the United Nations itself, but eventually it came under the umbrella of the UN, and they're the UN's body that works on tech policy. And at the time, there was a conference called I believe it's the World Conference on International Telecommunications. And in the tech policy space, we like acronyms, so it's WCIT or WCIT. And my job mainly was to communicate about the meeting itself. So the UN itself and the foundation didn't really take a position on anything. We were a bit more of, communicating that the meeting's happening, here's how you can engage with it, and that kind of thing. Nonetheless, in my work, I began following the meeting, and it was very interesting. There was a lot of content in there that I knew very little about, but I found fascinating. And so part of what was happening at this meeting there were stark differences between two different kind of camps, if you will. So you had the US and Europe and other, what we would, I guess, commonly refer to as, the Western world, quote unquote, advocating for maintaining the status quo, if you will, of kind of a multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. And then you had another camp that wanted to have more of a treaty body perform a lot of the critical internet functions and bring it under the UN and have it operate in kind of a one nation, one vote type system. And the meeting got very heated, and the sides basically threw up their hands and walked out of the room. And while that's obviously not productive, I found it dramatic and interesting. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. This is an interesting space to kind of watch, right? So I did. And that's how I learned about ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And I was like, oh, okay, let me take a look at this and just see what it's all about. As I learned more about it, I just found it really fascinating and really unique. I had interactions with other multi-stakeholder initiatives at the foundation, mainly in the area of the environment and like climate. So the Rio Plus 20 conference was something that was happening at the same time I was at the foundation. And that was kind of my prototype for multi-stakeholder governance. And then when I looked at ICANN, I saw an organization and what it worked on, and I was like, oh wow, this is really how it's done. And it just became just something that I really got very interested in. And it was coming time for me at the foundation to look to make a move. And as I followed ICANN, I was looking at some things, and they had a job at the time. I think it was like working with the CEOs, like correspondence with governments and the UN and stuff like that. And I thought that was interesting, so I applied for it. Um, I interviewed for it. I got a couple of rounds of interviews. I actually interviewed with the CEO, and I wound up not getting the job. um, and then you fast forward probably 9 months later, probably the fall of 2013, late summer, probably. And I saw another position open up. I'd still been kind of keeping track of ICANN and that whole kind of multi-stakeholder, multilateral tussle that was going on. And it was a stakeholder engagement job. I didn't really know what stakeholder engagement meant, but it looked like it fit my skills. So I applied to that and I interviewed, and I eventually got it, and I came on board in September of 2013, and that's it's almost 9 years ago now. It's hard to believe, but that's how I got into internet governance and tech policy and ICANN, and it has been quite a ride. I mean, it's really unlike any other organization I've ever worked with or come into contact with. It's really interesting stuff.
You hit on a really interesting and important point there on the importance of perseverance. And, if you don't get your initial dream job, then there's so much merit in just keeping your eye on other opportunities that might crop up, and then you never know. Now looking back 9 years later, here you are. I want to get into your current work at ICANN a little bit. So, what are you working on right now, and what are some interesting projects that you've worked on before?
So, I mean, I think, again, this kind of stakeholder engagement position is pretty unique. It's a bit of a hybrid in a way. I kind of function as a bit of a nerve center for liaising with not only externally with the stakeholders in the space, in business, civil society, government, academia, and of course the technical community, but also internally and coordinating between different departments at ICANN to, either get the word out or support the active stakeholders that are participating in ICANN's policy development processes. So, that involves working with the communications department, the domains and strategy department, with the legal department and public responsibility. So it's really touches kind of every part of the organization and every part of kind of the field of work that we do. As far as what's going on right now, I mean, it's a very busy time. I mean, in some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, I think a lot of similar discussions are happening kind of on the intergovernmental front. right? So there are a lot of these multi-stakeholder and multilateral meetings that are happening either as we speak or also later in the fall that'll be really important to the future of how critical internet resources are managed, right? So there's for the ITU itself, right? There's a plenipotentiary, which is in the fall, the Internet Governance Forum, and then later the World Summit on the Information Society, WSIS plus 20, right? So that'll be next year. That'll be 2023. So there's those conversations that are happening, and then of course, internally, but not internally, but more kind of narrower scope in terms of just ICANN itself. There's obviously a lot going on right now. We have our annual general meeting, which is coming up at the end of September, ICANN 75. So there is a lot of prep work that goes into executing an ICANN meeting and making sure that it's the best experience, not only for the stakeholders that either travel to the meeting or if they participate remotely to do that, but also the host country itself, which the meeting being Kuala Lumpur here in September. So there's a lot there. There are different working groups at ICANN working on a whole host of issues, including areas around new generic top-level domains, right? The program that was launched in 2012, just before I got there or here, and then also, a prospective, new round of those in the future. So very busy time.
I can only imagine. And so you've mentioned a couple of different meetings where there's discussions going on different facets of internet governance. But what do these meetings look like in practice? What happens at a typical meeting? And maybe we can take an ICANN meeting as an example.
Yeah, so I mean, for an ICANN meeting itself, it is, it's we're operating obviously in a pandemic environment. I hesitate to say post-pandemic. We are doing this Kuala Lumpur meeting will be our second in-person meeting since restrictions are lifted. So with ICANN, in some ways, we've always been a hybrid. I mean, there's always been a robust remote participation at ICANN meetings. It is now even more so since the pandemic. I mean, we've gotten really good at that aspect of things. So you don't need to be, physically on the ground to participate. Obviously, there's challenges with time zone and depending on where you live and connectivity. Obviously, there's always going to be challenges with that. And I am, always of the mind that nothing can really replace kind of in-person interaction and experience. But these resources are there and they're good. There'll typically be like for a meeting like the one in September, which is kind of the largest one, so the annual general meeting. So it's the broadest in scope, right? It's almost a week in length. So there's usually kind of a welcome kind of ceremony with the big dignitaries and others, and there'll be some speeches on the issues that are going to be covered at the meeting. It's unclear to me if that did not happen in the last meeting that was just hybrid, and it's unclear if it's going to happen in this one because of the pandemic and having people, there's restrictions on who can be in the room, et cetera. But it would typically start with some kind of curtain raiser like that, and then the different working groups at ICANN begin, kind of break off and begin discussing policies in their different constituencies, and then obviously feed in remote participation for all of those. There's typically a day set out during the meeting where each constituency from those sectors that I mentioned before, like business, civil society, government, et cetera, meet with the ICANN board So there'll be that. There'll be different engagement events and things around it. Again, less so during the pandemic, but in pre-pandemic days, there would be quite a bit of that. And then eventually, like in September at the end, there'll be a public board meeting where the board will, vote on resolutions and such. So that's kind of the flow of it. But the kind of interesting thing about ICANN and a lot of these internet governance bodies is a lot of it happens not at the meeting itself, right? So there's a lot of conference calls and work on email lists, and it's a 24/7 thing, right? So that it's really, it takes a lot of dedication to be part of this ecosystem and develop policy here. But that gives you just kind of a little snapshot.
We'll be right back. The Internet Law and Policy Foundry's 2022 Policy Hackathon is the Foundry's third policy hackathon, happening this October 14 through 16. The Policy Hackathon is a 3-day event that brings together creative technical and policy professionals from around the world to tackle emerging and long-standing problems related to the intersection of law, policy, and technology. The theme of this year's hackathon is privacy, trust, and safety in the metaverse. Additionally, the Foundry is holding a writing competition and a series of virtual events about all things metaverse. For more information about the hackathon, the writing competition, and other hackathon-related events, you can visit the Foundry's website, ilpfoundry.us, or our social media pages. So I want to shift gears a bit and ask about the IANA transition. So what is it, and what did your work on that project entail?
Yeah, so well, first off, IANA is another acronym, and that stands for the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. And that is the largest project that I've worked on since I've been at ICANN, and is sort of widely recognized as the kind of seminal moment for multi-stakeholder internet governance. It was something that was envisioned really since ICANN's founding in 1998. And, it took a long time to get there, but basically, so I came to ICANN in the fall of 2013. And then I think about 6 months later, maybe a little less, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, which is an agency within the Department of Commerce, declared that they were going to ask that what they call the IANA functions, which are basically the resource, right, the names and the numbers, that the stewardship over that be transferred from the US government to the global multi-stakeholder community. And they asked ICANN to be the convener of the process to kind of shepherd that through and come up with the kind of framework for what would replace, NTIA in that role. And so, when we talk about kind of stewardship over the functions, right? So ICANN, IANA is, a department of ICANN, right? And so when ICANN was formed, we were, tasked to maintain those, functions, but the U.S. government kind of maintained I guess, kind of a oversight role of sorts, in that if there were changes to the root zone, the ICANN, before they went to the company that is the root zone operator, which is VeriSign, they would go to the US government, and the US government in the form of NTIA, and they would okay that, right? And so it was seen kind of globally as, it was kind of the last tether of kind of what people would see as US kind of control over the internet, right? And I think it was, causing a lot of, I think, of misperception that the US kind of still controlled the internet. So I think it was very important, not only from an optics wise, but also to prove the the worth of multi-stakeholder internet governance, and prove that it worked, right? So so what this was it would take kind of NTIA out of that role, and then replace it with kind of the multi-stakeholder community, and accountability mechanisms for ICANN, the organization, right? And so my role in that was a lot of strategic planning, awareness raising, and education, communications, because a lot of people didn't know that ICANN existed. Again, like as I said at the top of the show, I didn't even know it existed, right? So a little bit of what like we would term as kind of bringing ICANN to the world and saying, hey, here we are, here's the important function that we serve, and there's, this is happening, and here's how you can be involved. So a little bit of that, a lot of supporting the community of stakeholders that were already involved at ICANN, who have been involved for decades already, and making sure that they were supported in the work, right? Because ICANN, the organization, we function mainly as a secretariat, right? I mean, the community of stakeholders are who sets the policy, right? And then obviously the board has the authority as far as ratifying that's concerned, but our function is in support of the community, right? So it's a little bit of kind of supporting them, and while at the same time doing some awareness raising and education about this whole internet governance thing, which was very new to a lot of people in 2013. And now, obviously, in my region, I'm tasked with the US and Canada and North America, right? So a lot of my stakeholders knew about ICANN and were involved, but a lot of my colleagues in the other regions, their governments and other stakeholders just didn't know at all, right? And so a lot of kind of talking, I had colleagues on the other members of the engagement team working with their governments and saying, there's a place for you at the table at ICANN, right? In the form of, we have something called the Government Advisory Committee, where there's governments, and there was we saw just a very high ramp up of participation in that area. We're now up to over 170 governments participating in the Government Advisory Committee, and over 30 observers. So, there was a lot of that kind of work of in some ways selling the model, and proving that the internet has worked. It's worked very well, and this is part of the reason why. And obviously, there was, in my being in DC, right, there was a heavy kind of Washington component to the whole thing. And so going around to universities and technical organizations and think tanks, pardon me, and doing roundtables and things of that nature, to really kind of build the case for multi-stakeholder internet governance, and really, kind of let the community shine a little bit. And it was, it was a lot of work. I mean, it's 2 years. I mean, the transition didn't go through. Like I said, the Commerce Department initiated it I think it was March of 2014, if I remember correctly. And it wasn't completed until October 1st of 2016. So it was a long campaign, but well worth it.
So, how is that model shaping up now? And what are some of the challenges faced contemporarily in continuing the work of IANA?
I think what we're seeing now is very similar to what we saw a decade ago, only with a bit of a twist. I mean, you're still seeing, even despite the success of the IANA transition and the success of the multi-stakeholder model, you're still seeing corners of the world where um, there are nations that have just very different ideas about how the internet should be governed, right? And those are trying to figure out, you know, I think countries sometimes struggle to find where they fit in internet governance. And there's a place for them at ICANN, right, in the Government Advisory Committee, and that's something we continually try and impress upon people. But there is, always going to be a bit of a tussle and a bit of folks who would like to see more of a UN type governance model, a multilateral type model. And so that's still present. I think that's something that just continually comes up. I think also now, 2022 is way different than 2014 in the sense of kind of rising nationalism and, where does the internet fit into that, right? At ICANN, our thing is a single, stable, secure, and interoperable internet, right? But as you layer in kind of other things that really don't touch on ICANN's remit, like content and then some other elements of privacy and things like that, you see kind of a more nationalistic tinge to what a lot of countries are doing, and that is creating some that's creating some challenges for the community.
So, digging into a little bit more about you, what are you reading or listening to right now?
The Ramones. No, I'm just kidding. So, I mean, I think, in all seriousness, I mean, from a tech policy perspective, I think I listen to the Sunday Show by Tech Policy Press a lot. I think that's good. Also, there's one from a think tank in DC called the Innovation Files, which is pretty good. And then obviously the Tech Policy Grind. But and then kind of outside of tech policy, just kind of broader things. I listen to the Lost Debate a lot, which is a podcast which is, I mean, it's like there's a Democrat, there's a libertarian, and then there's, I guess, kind of a conservative in there. And so it's a nice podcast that talks about contemporary issues without like kind of the nonsense of like of a cable news show where like everybody's yelling at each other. Like they, seem to be civil, and I like things that challenge your thinking, right? I enjoy, I might not agree with someone when I'm, listening to them or reading what they say, but if they're, saying it in an intelligent way and communicating it effectively, then, I want to hear that because I think that's helpful. In terms of what I'm reading, I mean, it's August in DC. I think the heat index is like almost 100 degrees now today. So most of my reading is pretty light right now. So I'm reading. I'm a big baseball nut. So I'm reading the biography of Tom Seaver, the great pitcher for the Mets. And then I'm also reading a book that is quite long. It's longer than I thought it was going to be, but it's called Tinderbox. It's about the history of HBO. And I've always had kind of a just fascination with media in general and the development of media, be it radio, TV, or film. In terms of if anybody's listening who's not who's kind of looking for fodder for kind of tech politics, tech policy, or internet governance, I think I'll give a couple pops for Professor Laura Denardis's books. They're several years old now, but they're still really relevant. Internet and Everything and Protocol Politics were those were really important resources for me when I first started here, because again, I didn't really know which way was up when I got to ICANN, and so it's a steep kind of learning curve. It takes a while, but it's worth it.
So you have an 8-year-old. How does your son impact your sort of drive and motivation to um, help govern the internet?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? So, so I will always remember that my first day at ICANN was September 16th of 2013. And there's no reason why I would remember my first day at any other company or this one other than the fact that on September 22nd, 2013, my son was born. So it was like, got hired, came to the office, got settled, and then looked to my boss and I was like, "Oh, see you in a month." so, so it's kind of interesting. Like my ICANN, my time at ICANN is very strongly tied to my son and kind of his development, and all my colleagues remember him, kind of running around the office when he was really little. So it's kind of interesting. It's tough to do tech policy and internet governance and ICANN work as a parent. I will say that, it's not easy, right? So there's a lot of travel when things are not, you know, when we're not in a pandemic, right? And some of that is started, we've started some travel at ICANN now, certainly not on the level that it was back in 2019, but eventually, hopefully it will, get back to where it was, because it's important work. So there's a lot of travel. There's calls at bizarre hours sometimes, right? I mean, it is a global thing, right? The internet's a global resource, so there's always, a call you got to be on. But so it's a lot about kind of managing your day, and making sure you build in kind of not only breaks for yourself, but also build in, kind of that family time. ICANN meetings, ICANN public meetings, like we talked about, right? They're long days, and I think that holds true for other internet governance meetings, be it the IGF or anything else. And it's important because, I mean, the internet is just vital. I mean, it's vital to my life, right? And I'm 40 and he's 8, right? So if it's so vital to me, imagine how important it's going to be for him as advances come along, right? I mean, I can't. It's interesting. We were driving from I think we were coming back from the zoo or something, and I put my phone up, mounted it on, put the map on, and it wasn't working, right? There wasn't like service, and I kind of knew the roads a little bit, but he was like, "Oh, what do we do?" And I was like, "Well," and I had to go through the story of like, we didn't always have that, right? But for him, it's like those things are just like built in, right? And there's going to be even more innovation. So it's important that we, that I, it's kind of a, that I, show up and help, this community, do their work, and help, maintain a single global internet that thrives.
Absolutely. Do you have any advice for parents who are in the field of tech policy and sort of maintaining that family life and commitment to the work with all its chaos and crazy schedules?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say, you know, like family first type thing, right? Make sure you take care of your relationships at home, be it with your son and daughter, your spouse, your grandparents, or whomever. You know, make sure that in the inclination to sign up for a meeting or go travel to this thing or take this call or take that meeting, that just keep in mind that you know the work's always going to be there, right? But those moments, with your family, particularly if you have a little kid, um, they're fleeting in a way. So make sure that you prioritize them and prioritize that, because um, meetings will come and go, and you'll win some battles and you lose some battles, kind of career wise and professionally. Um, but your family's always going to be there, and you want to make sure that you're there for them too.
So before we wrap up, I want to get into our event coming up next week with Vint, Cerf, and Steve Crocker that I'm thrilled that we'll be co-moderating. So, do you want to give the audience a little preview of what to expect with our next podcast episode and some highlights of what you anticipate from the conversation?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really exciting, and I'm really excited to be hosting it with you in Washington, just a block away from the White House, at WeWork White House. It's really great. I mean, I've known Vint and Steve for quite some time. They're both past chairs of the ICANN board, and I worked with both of them a lot during the transition days. I mean, Steve was chair of the ICANN board during those years, and Vint, who is still at Google, was there in that capacity as well then. And you know, I've just always wanted to have an hour to just sit and talk to them, and I've obviously seen them at ICANN meetings, or in Vint's case at regional internet registry meetings. But it's always like, there's always a lot going on, right? So to just have a dedicated, 60 minutes to just talk to them about, you know, first off, I mean, their kind of relationship is fascinating, right? Because they're childhood friends, that, worked on, uh, this thing together, and then it blossomed into what it is now. So kind of a look at, what was going through your head then, like how did all this come about? And then a little bit of a retrospective, right? So here we are, right, in 1969, right, ARPANET, and now here we are in 2022. Take a look at that, and what do you think? Like just what do you see? What parts of your vision were fulfilled, and what maybe is still not quite there yet? What are your thoughts on the challenges? And I think it's just really, it's going to be a real treat to just have those two guys, and just be able to connect them with other folks at the Foundry, and then obviously others, in the community, because there's just so much to learn from both of them. They're just brilliant people.
I can't wait. I think it'll be a really fascinating conversation to hear from their perspectives and uh, ample experience in pioneering the internet. So I'm very excited. And for anyone tuning in, uh, make sure that you either tune into the live stream, which will be happening at 4 p.m. Eastern Time next week on August 18th, a week from today. And if you're in DC, consider popping by. We have an Eventbrite link where you can sign up. So all of that info will be in the show notes. Well, Joe, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Reema.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tech Policy Grind podcast. Be sure to check out the Foundry on LinkedIn and Twitter. And if you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review and give us a 5-star rating. It really helps out the show. If you're interested in supporting the show, reach out to us at foundrypodcasts@ilpfoundry.us. You can find our email in the show notes as well. You can see the full show notes and download the episode transcript for every episode on our website, ilpfoundry.us/podcast. The Tech Policy Grind podcast comes out every Thursday. See you next time. The Tech Policy Grind podcast was created by the fellows at the Internet Law and Policy Foundry. It's produced and edited by me, Reema Musa, with support from the incredible Foundry Fellows. Special thanks to Lama Muhammad, our social coordinator, and Allison McReynolds, our accessibility coordinator, for their support in bringing this episode to air.